Cliff Richard is 84. Try not to gasp when you see him today. For more than 60 years, Sir Cliff Richard didn't just have a music career. He became a huge part of British music history. People called him the Elvis Presley of the UK. Cliff wasn't just Britain's first real rock star. He was their answer to a worldwide music revolution. He had a voice that people of all ages loved, grace that stopped gossip, and a power to keep going that beat time itself. He became a symbol of never giving up. He was an artist who always worked hard and a man who chose doing the right thing over wild partying. Fame never ruined his good character, and hard times never destroyed his faith. What really happened to the man who once ruled an era with style, control, and heartfelt beliefs? Get ready, because his story is sadder than the world ever dared to think. Cliff Richard's story didn't start with clapping hands. It started with quiet hunger, nights of crying, and a little boy watching the world fall apart around his family. In 1940, in the heat and colors of Lucknow, British India, Harry Roger Webb was born into a world still controlled by empire, but already falling apart. His early life was full of opposites, servants and rules on the outside, but silence and worry inside the home. In 1948, when Harry was just 8, India became independent. The British Raj was gone. For his family, this meant they had to leave, not go on an adventure. They packed what little they had and got on a ship to England. Not the pretty England on postcards, but a gray, rainy country after the war, trying to rebuild from ruins. The Webb family moved into a tiny apartment in Carshalton, Surrey. They went from having servants in India to crowding together in one room with no heat. There were nights I watched my mother cry without making a sound, Cliff would remember later. His father, Roger, used to manage food for a railroad company in India, but now he couldn't find work. Money was tight, and keeping their pride was even harder. Young Harry quickly learned that smiles were like money, and staying quiet was like armor. These early years, far away from glamour, became the foundation of a strength that few would ever see, but everyone would benefit from. Music at first wasn't a dream job. It was a way to escape. He discovered American rock and roll on the radio, and it opened something inside him. Elvis Presley, Little Richard, Buddy Holly. These weren't just voices. They were lifelines. They were color in a gray world. Suddenly, I wanted to be on stage, he said years later. I wanted to make people feel what they made me feel. In school, he was shy and awkward, not the poster boy he would become, but a tall, unsure teenager who knew he couldn't afford college and couldn't stand the thought of working in a factory. He started singing with friends, scraping together shows at youth clubs and church halls. One night, he borrowed his uncle's guitar. The next, he borrowed his mother's courage. At age 17, he changed his name to Cliff Richard, honoring Little Richard and the idea of a cliff being strong and unmovable. The name was more than just a new brand. It was a shield, a promise to himself. Harry Webb, the boy who watched his mother cry, who shared a bed with his brothers and sisters to stay warm, was gone. In his place stood Cliff, calm, charming, and unbreakable. In 1958, Cliff and his band, then called the Drifters, recorded Move It, a song that would later be called the first real British rock and roll song. It was rough, electric, and rebellious. It climbed to number 2 on the UK charts. Suddenly, a new sound had arrived, and with it, a new face. But behind that face was still the same boy who had learned to turn pain into music and struggle into performance. These beginnings weren't a straight path to stardom. They were like walking on a tightrope between being hungry and having hope, between what he had lost and what he dreamed of becoming. And while the world would come to know Cliff Richard as a clean-cut icon, a symbol of faith and good behavior, Few understood that he had been shaped not by fame, but by quiet hardship. He didn't rise despite his struggles. He rose because of them. The difference between his public image and his private beginnings was, in truth, quietly sad. A boy shaped by loss, driven by duty, and kept going by a dream the world almost stole before it ever saw him. Long before the crazy fans, before the stage name, or the screaming girls, there was just Harry Webb, a quiet teenager with a used guitar and a dream that felt too big for his modest life in Hertfordshire. Music wasn't an escape. It was a lifeline, inspired. By the exciting presence of Elvis Presley, young Harry found himself drawn to the raw energy of American rock and roll. He formed a band with school friends, first named the Drifters, and spent countless nights practicing in garages and church halls. One day, by pure luck, their demo track, Move It, caught the attention of producer Norrie Paramore at EMI. It was only supposed to be a B-side. But when a radio DJ heard it and demanded it be flipped to the A-side, everything changed. That moment, pure chance, raw talent, and perfect timing would shoot Harry Webb into Cliff Richard, Britain's first true rock and roll star. Fame may have come suddenly, but Cliff Richard carried it like a man still learning how to breathe underwater. From 1958 to 1963, Britain fell under what came to be known as Cliff hysteria. Teenagers screamed, records flew off the shelves, and a once awkward boy from Surrey became the face of a generation hungry for joy. Move It, his first single, wasn't just a hit. It was a huge change. With its rough guitar sounds and youthful swagger, it broke America's control over rock and roll and climbed to number 2 on the UK charts. The Guardian newspaper would later call it the first real British rock record. Cliff followed that success with a bunch of hits. Living Doll, The Young Ones, Summer Holiday. These weren't just songs. They were anthems of young people after the war finally claiming their own identity. Hollywood came calling, but he didn't need to go. British movies embraced him. His musical comedies brought millions to movie theaters, turning Cliff into not just a pop star, but a household name. He was clean-cut, magnetic, and uniquely British. In a world still hurt from war, Cliff Richard offered not rebellion, but comfort, wrapped in rhythm. Then came 1964. The Beatles exploded onto the world stage. For most artists of Cliff's time, it was the end, but not for him. That year alone, Cliff scored 6 top 10 hits in the UK, more than the Beatles themselves. Paul McCartney and John Lennon would later admit that Cliff had paved the way for them, but instead of copying their revolutionary style, Cliff chose to stay different. He didn't chase trends. He carved out his own path. Yet behind the victories, a storm was building, one not of music, but of the soul. In 1966, at the peak of his fame, Cliff experienced what he would later call a spiritual awakening. Influenced by American preacher Billy Graham, he made a public announcement of his Christian faith. In an industry that celebrated excess, Cliff's decision to embrace purity and purpose was almost radical. The backlash was quick. Fans left. Shows were canceled. There were rumors he would quit music altogether. Cliff himself admitted, "There was a time I felt completely lost. I wasn't sure if I was playing a part or living a lie." But rather than retreat, he reinvented himself. His newfound faith didn't shrink his art. It refined it. "I stopped performing characters," he once said. "I started performing as me." This inner change didn't soften his edge. It sharpened his determination. Cliff remained a fixture in the charts well into the 70s, with hits like Miss You Nights and Devil Woman, songs that blended emotional depth with beautiful melodies. He dared to age with grace in an industry addicted to youth. But the journey wasn't without pain. Even at his peak, Cliff struggled with loneliness, the cost of fame, and the pressure of being seen as the perfect idol. Every time he smiled for a camera, he hid the weight of keeping a spotless image. Every time he sang of love, he carried the ache of love lost or never begun. His wasn't a life of rock star wildness, but one of disciplined devotion to music, to faith, and to the quiet dignity of keeping promises. This chapter of Cliff's life shows duality, the glamour of stage lights and the shadows they cast. He wasn't just Britain's answer to Elvis. He was Britain's echo of something deeper. Not rebellion, but resilience. Not fame, but faith. Not chaos, but quiet conviction. And in that, he became something rare. An icon with a soul still searching and a heart still healing. Just when it seemed Cliff Richard's place in music history was unshakable, the 1970s dealt him a brutal blow. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the charts no longer echoed his voice. In 1975, he faced a painful drought. No hits, no headlines, no clear path forward. For a man whose life had been shaped by applause and adoration, the silence was deafening. It wasn't just a business dip. It was a crisis of existence. Cliff later remembered, "There was a moment when I thought, maybe I've had my time. Maybe the curtain's falling." But the story was far from over. In 1976, Cliff released Devil Woman, a bold, haunting track that shattered expectations and soared into the top 10 of the U.S. Billboard charts, his first major breakthrough in America. The song's dark appeal and polished production signaled a dramatic evolution in his artistry. Suddenly, critics who once dismissed him as a teen idol were now comparing his work to the soulful depths of Marvin Gaye. Rock legends like Elton John and Eric Clapton began to speak of Cliff with genuine respect. He wasn't chasing youth anymore. He was mastering reinvention. This era marked a rebirth. Gone were the lightweight pop tunes of his early years. In their place came songs steeped in deep thought, maturity, and emotional resonance. The 1980s brought hits like We Don't Talk Anymore, a sad anthem that resonated across generations. The album, Always Guaranteed, reaffirmed his commercial vitality, while his Christmas single Mistletoe and Wine became a beloved classic, adding a new seasonal layer to his musical legacy. Then, in 1989, Cliff delivered one of the most defining moments of his career. The event at Wembley Stadium, more than a concert, it was a retrospective celebration, an emotional journey through 5 decades of music, faith, and personal growth. With thousands of fans singing along, Cliff proved he wasn't just a relic of the past. He was a living legend who still had something to say. And he wasn't done yet. In 1990, his song Savior's Day topped the UK charts once again, reaffirming his uncanny ability to stay relevant. It wasn't about chasing trends. It was about timeless sincerity, the kind that doesn't fade with fashion. What makes this chapter so moving is not just the comeback, but the quiet dignity with which Cliff endured the descent. He didn't lash out. He didn't beg for relevance. Instead, he returned to his roots, faith, music, and truth. That's how he rose again. Not louder, but deeper. Not faster, but stronger. His story during these years isn't just one of revival. It's a masterclass in resilience. It's a reminder that even legends can fall, but the great ones, they rise again and again. For all his dazzling success and decades under the spotlight, Cliff Richard's deepest chapters were written not on stage, but in silence, in glances that never turned into promises, in loves that slipped away, and in the haunting echo of a life lived without a lasting partner. The world saw the superstar, the eternal bachelor, but few truly understood the price he paid to keep the music alive. His heart, it seemed, always had to take second place. Perhaps no name in Cliff's personal story carries as much quiet weight as Olivia Newton-John. Their bond, spanning over 50 years, was built not on scandal or spectacle, But on shared harmonies and unspoken affection, Cliff once said, I was in love with her, but she was engaged to someone else. Olivia would go on to marry Bruce Welch, Cliff's own bandmate and closest friend, yet Cliff never turned away. They continued performing together, their voices joining like old letters never sent. Their final duet in 2015, Singing Suddenly, was less a performance and more a farewell whispered through music. When Olivia passed away in 2022, Cliff didn't offer a public statement full of empty words. He simply said, she didn't die. She just stopped living. Few sentences have ever sounded more heartbreaking, but Olivia wasn't the only almost. In 1961, Cliff poured his heart into a 3-page letter to Delia Wicks, the Australian dancer he had loved for 18 months. He told her, the cruel truth, being a pop singer, I have to give up one priceless thing, the right to any lasting relationship with any special girl. It wasn't just a breakup. It was a confession of sacrifice. He chose his mother, his sisters, and his calling over the possibility of personal happiness. The letter wasn't just goodbye. It was a wound that never fully closed. Then came Jackie Irving. Utterly beautiful, Cliff once said. For a time, they were inseparable, and those close to him believed this was the one. But again, life, career, and fate pulled them apart. Jackie would later marry another singer, leaving Cliff once more at the edge of something that might have been. In the 1980s, the world briefly hoped love had finally found him in the form of tennis champion Sue Barker. Their relationship was public, affectionate, and genuine. Cliff even spoke of marriage, saying in a 1983 interview, if marriage comes on the horizon, I shall relish it. But months later, he admitted, I didn't love her quite enough to commit the rest of my life. Sue, ever gracious, once said, we love each other, and we still do. And so the pattern continued. Love came close, looked him in the eyes, and quietly walked away. For decades, tabloids questioned his choices, whispered about his solitude. But Cliff never chased rumors, never explained himself. Instead, he let silence speak. In one moment of reflection, he admitted, I've had a few false alarms. I've been in love, but marriage is a big commitment, and being an artist consumes a great deal of time. His life in the end wasn't marked by scandal or heartbreak, but by the quiet ache of sharing stages, not homes, of holding hands in public, but never signing marriage papers. It's a kind of tragedy that doesn't scream. It whispers. And in those whispers, Cliff Richard's story becomes not just one of fame, but of unimaginable restraint, devotion, and the echo of songs sung to an empty room when the crowd is gone. If he ever loved, he loved in silence. If he ever mourned, he mourned with dignity. And if he ever longed, it was for a life he never allowed himself to live. Perhaps that's the price of being eternal. You give everything to the world and keep nothing for yourself. In an era where fame often came tied to scandal and oversharing, Cliff Richard chose a different path, a path of dignified silence. He never married, he never had children, and he never felt the need to explain himself. While the world guessed, Cliff stood firm behind a simple principle. Not every truth demands an audience. His life was his own, and in guarding it, he became one of the rare stars who maintained mystery in a world that demanded confession. For decades, persistent rumors surrounded Cliff's sexuality, whispers made louder by tabloids hungry for scandal and silence they couldn't crack. But Cliff never gave them what they wanted. Instead, he met it with measured grace. If I was, he once said plainly, would it matter? In those few words lay a powerful resistance, not denial, not confirmation, but a refusal to let others define his worth or identity. It was the kind of quiet defiance only someone deeply at peace with himself could afford. Cliff's refusal to label, to conform, or to justify became over time a kind of statement in itself. While others explained and clarified, he chose to let his legacy speak louder than gossip. And perhaps the most enduring part of that legacy is the bond he shared with John Macklin, a former missionary from New York, who entered Cliff's life in 2001. The two became inseparable. Macklin, by Cliff's own admission, became a source of companionship, strength, and day-to-day support. He helped manage Cliff's homes, shared his travel, and more importantly, shared in his solitude. To some, their connection invited further speculation, but Cliff never took the bait. In a rare moment of reflection, he said of Macklin, "It's nice to have someone who cares about you, not because you're famous, but just because you're you." It was less a defense and more a testament to the power of chosen family, of emotional intimacy that defies definition, and of a life lived on his own terms. In a world obsessed with who sleeps beside whom, Cliff Richard remained a fortress, not out of shame or fear, but out of a belief that some parts of the heart deserve sanctuary, not spotlight. And perhaps in choosing not to be understood, he taught us the rarest kind of courage, to be whole without being explained. Just when it seemed that Cliff Richard had weathered every storm fame could bring, when he had survived heartbreak, outlived musical eras, and reclaimed his place in the hearts of millions, an even darker cloud descended. It began with the sound of helicopter blades slicing through the still summer air, a sudden invasion that shattered the serenity of Cliff Richard's private life. On that fateful day in 2014, his home was swarmed by police, cameras hovering overhead, the BBC broadcasting every moment of the raid in real time. Cliff, a knighted icon of British music, a man with no prior criminal record, watched his reputation implode on national television, all based on an anonymous allegation. There were no charges, no prior notice, no due process, just lights, lenses, and the spectacle of suspicion. For a man who had devoted over 5 decades to uplifting audiences through his music, the assault on his dignity was not just public, it was devastatingly personal. The raid was part of Operation U-Tree, a sweeping investigation into historical sexual abuse allegations in the UK, sparked in the wake of the Jimmy Savile scandal. But Cliff Richard's case stood apart. There was no accuser named, no formal complaint ever brought before the court. And yet his name was dragged through headlines as if guilt had already been decided. For 22 harrowing months, he lived under investigation, stripped of peace, privacy, and the presumption of innocence. It was like living in a nightmare, he would later recall. I felt as though the ground had disappeared beneath me. The toll was excruciating. Cliff began to lose weight, struggled with insomnia, and suffered a severe outbreak of shingles, a painful reminder that stress does not just torment the mind, but punishes the body. Friends and close confidants noted that the ever-cheerful entertainer had dimmed. "They stole my joy," he admitted in a later interview. It wasn't just his public image that suffered. It was his very sense of self. In the eyes of millions, he went from beloved icon to suspected predator overnight, and no amount of silence could stem the tide of doubt. Worse still, the BBC had coordinated with the police in covering the raid. It wasn't just reporting the news. They had become part of the spectacle. As cameras zoomed in on Cliff's private residence, capturing aerial footage and broadcasting his home address, the act crossed the line from journalism into invasion. He wasn't asked for comment. He wasn't protected by anonymity. He was served up to the public as breaking news, his life reduced to a media event. But Cliff Richard, even under siege, did not retreat into bitterness. Once the Crown Prosecution Service concluded there was insufficient evidence to proceed and no charges were filed, he turned his anguish into action. In 2018, he filed a lawsuit against the BBC for breach of privacy and won. The court ruled that the BBC's coverage had been a serious invasion of his rights, awarding him more than £2 million in damages. It was a landmark case, not just for Cliff, but for every individual who had ever feared being falsely tried by the press. "This is not just about me," he declared after the verdict. "This is about the principle that people are innocent until proven guilty, not the other way around." That victory, however symbolic, could not fully erase the scars. Cliff later revealed that he had considered selling all his homes and leaving the UK altogether. "There were times I didn't want to live here anymore," he confessed. The sense of betrayal ran deep, not just from the media, but from a society that had so easily turned suspicion into spectacle. For nearly 2 years, he lived in limbo, unable to tour, to create, to move forward. Yet somehow, through it all, he endured, not with defiance, but with resilience. He returned to the stage. He released new music. He stood up for the voiceless, the falsely accused, the publicly humiliated. His ordeal became more than a personal battle. It became a symbol of the dangers of trial by media. In interviews since, Cliff has spoken not with rage, but with a quiet dignity. "They tried to destroy me, but I was determined not to let them win." There is something haunting about what Cliff endured, not just the injustice, but the silence he was forced to keep, while the world speculated. And yet, in the echo of that silence, something powerful emerged. A man whose dignity refused to be erased, whose voice would not be silenced by fear. His story is not just one of survival. It is a cautionary tale for an age where fame makes one, both idol and target. In the end, Cliff Richard did not just reclaim his name. He defended a principle, stood firm in the eye of a storm, and reminded the world that no reputation, no matter how noble, is safe from suspicion unless we learn to separate headlines from truth. And for that, he earned not just sympathy, but a renewed respect. Because surviving fame is hard. But surviving betrayal while keeping your soul intact is something only the strongest among us can do. Now, in his mid-80s, Sir Cliff Richard leads a life that many would describe as both enviable and inspirational. Despite the relentless ticking of time, Cliff remains vibrantly active, splitting his time between his residences in Barbados and Portugal while maintaining ties to the UK. His Barbados estate, known as Coral Sundown, is a 6-bedroom villa with a tennis court and pool nestled within. The upscale Sugar Hill community, the villa, once available for rent at up to $3,000 per night, reflects a lifestyle of elegance and tranquility. Meanwhile, his Quinta do Moinho estate in Portugal, spanning 30 acres, features vineyards, 3 guest houses, and breathtaking countryside views. Though he listed the property for sale at $7 million in 2017, its deep sentimental value remains. Tied to decades of memories and quiet retreats, Cliff previously resided in a luxurious home in the St. George's Hill area of England before downsizing in 2006, illustrating his shift toward a more serene, less ostentatious lifestyle. Financially, Cliff Richard's net worth is estimated between $90 to $100 million, a reflection of a 6-decade career that saw more than 260 million records sold globally. He remains the 3rd best-selling singles artist in British history, behind only the Beatles and Elvis Presley. Despite his immense wealth, Cliff has chosen to lead a modest life marked by personal discipline and spiritual reflection. His car collection, featuring a Bentley Mulsanne, a Mercedes GLS 63, and a Mazda CX-5, demonstrates his appreciation for comfort and class without excessive display. Remarkably, Cliff continues to perform. His 2023 orchestral album, Cliff with Strings, My Kinda Life, reached the top 5 in the UK charts, proving that his voice and musical relevance endure. In 2025, he embarked on the Can't Stop Me Now tour, marking his 85th birthday with performances Across the UK, Australia, and New Zealand, when asked about his secret to longevity, Cliff attributed it to regular walks and playing tennis, eschewing rigorous gym routines in favor of natural, joyful movement. He explained, "Being 80 is a surprise to me. I just keep moving." This simple philosophy has allowed him to maintain not only his health, but also his connection with audiences spanning generations. Cliff Richard's personal life remains rooted in privacy and solitude. Having never married or had children, in the absence of a traditional family structure, questions about inheritance have occasionally surfaced. While details about his will remain undisclosed, it is widely assumed that his vast estate and wealth will be channeled into the charitable causes that have long defined his legacy. The Cliff Richard Charitable Trust, his personal foundation, provides grants to over 50 UK registered charities each quarter. The trust focuses on organizations serving children, the elderly, and those involved in medical research. His philanthropic efforts extend to long-standing support of institutions like the Shooting Star Children's Hospices, the Roy Castle Lung Cancer Foundation, and Alzheimer's Research UK. He is also a patron of Guitar Aid, regularly signing guitars. For auction to support global missions and medical outreach, Cliff's dedication to giving back began as early as the 1960s when he pledged to tithe 10% of his earnings to charitable causes, a commitment he has honored ever since. This sense of duty reflects a deeper spiritual calling that has guided his decisions both on and off the stage. In a world often driven by fame and fortune, Cliff Richard stands apart, a man who rose from hardship, weathered scandal, and aged with dignity, leaving behind a life rich not only in accolades, but in purpose, as he continues to live, perform, and serve with grace. Sir Cliff Richard's current chapter is not merely a quiet retirement. It is an enduring crescendo of a life well lived, echoing his belief that true legacy is measured not by what we keep, but by what we give. Is a reminder that greatness is not a destination, but a path paved with humility, generosity, and an unwavering commitment to one's values. The boy who once gazed at Elvis Presley in wonder became a man who inspired others with his voice, his resilience, and his heart. He is a living testament to the idea that fame, when anchored in faith and compassion, can illuminate rather than consume. So as we reflect on the extraordinary legacy of Sir Cliff Richard, we ask you, what part of his life spoke to your soul? Was it the triumph over pain, the silent strength behind his smile, or the grace with which he chose solitude over spectacle? Leave us your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters in keeping his story alive. If you were touched by this tribute, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because the world needs to remember that even legends are human, and that humanity is what makes them legendary.